When I look at the way political leaders talk about the Israel-Hamas conflict, I can't help but feel deeply disturbed by the sheer level of moral hypocrisy on display. It's as if the value of a human life depends entirely on where that person is born or what political side they happen to fall under. This isn't just about geopolitical alliances or strategic interests anymore. It's about our collective willingness to twist morality to fit a narrative that suits our biases. I've seen leaders, including Donald Trump, loudly denounce the actions of Hamas, calling them terrorists, which they certainly are when they target civilians. But what about when the Israeli military drops bombs on residential areas, schools, or refugee camps, killing innocent women and children? Why is that not called terrorism too? It frustrates me to no end that people who claim to stand for freedom, democracy, and human rights can so easily ignore blatant violations of those very principles when it comes from an ally. There's a terrifying selectivity in the way outrage is distributed. When Israelis are killed, there is global mourning, statements from the White House, candlelight vigils in European capitals. But when hundreds of Palestinians are killed in a matter of days, the same voices go silent or worse, justify the deaths as collateral damage. That term alone makes my blood boil. Since when did the death of a child become something to be categorized and brushed aside under a euphemism? What scares me the most is how normalized this hypocrisy has become. You hear people on TV and in politics speak with such moral certainty, and yet that certainty seems to vanish when the victims aren't the right kind. I've spoken to people who are enraged over a single Israeli hostage being held, but they're completely numb to the thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom have never even been charged with a crime. Why is one suffering more valid than the other? Why do we keep pretending this is about justice when it's so clearly about tribalism and political alignment? Donald Trump's so-called ceasefire deal is a perfect example of this. It's being hailed in some circles as a strong diplomatic move, but I can't help but question the real intent behind it. Is it really about ending the bloodshed, or is it about appealing to voters and saving face on the global stage? When I hear Trump or any political figure talk about peace, I listen for what they're not saying. Rarely do they acknowledge the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Rarely do they show empathy for the children growing up amid rubble with no access to clean water or education. It's always couched in terms of security for Israel, as if that justifies everything else. This hypocrisy extends beyond politicians. It infects the media and seeps into public opinion. News channels show one side of the suffering with dramatic footage and emotional storytelling, while the other side is reduced to statistics or, worse, demonized entirely. I've seen headlines that humanize Israeli victims and dehumanize Palestinian ones. I've watched as grieving Palestinian mothers are portrayed as part of a political problem rather than as human beings in unimaginable pain. It's dishonest and it's dangerous, because when we start believing that one group's pain matters less, we're on a path to moral decay. People accuse me of being biased when I point this out, but I believe it's the opposite. I refuse to align myself with either side when both are committing acts that hurt innocent people. I stand with the civilians on both sides who want nothing more than to live in peace. I believe in calling out terror wherever it exists, whether it's from Hamas rockets or Israeli airstrikes. There's no room for selective morality here. If we're going to talk about human rights, then we must mean human rights for all, not just for those we politically support. What I find most heartbreaking is how desensitized we've become. I've met people who will argue over technicalities, who will tell you why one group deserved their suffering because of their leadership, their religion, or their history. It's a coping mechanism, I think, a way to avoid facing the brutal truth that innocent people are dying while the world watches. But we need to break through that denial. We need to start seeing people as people again, not as symbols, not as enemies, but as fellow humans with hopes, dreams, and families. The hypocrisy I see isn't just a failure of politics, it's a failure of conscience. We have to hold all leaders accountable, no matter what side they're on. We have to demand the same standard of justice and empathy for everyone. If we don't, we risk becoming numb to injustice, and that's a loss none of us can afford. I speak out not because I hate one side or support the other, but because I believe the truth matters. And the truth is, our silence in the face of this double standard is part of the problem. If we truly care about peace, we need to start by being honest about ourselves, our biases, and the moral inconsistency that allows so much suffering to continue unchecked. When I hear Donald Trump speak about a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, I can't help but feel that there's something deeper at play than just a desire for peace. And knowing Trump's political style and the way he's handled international issues in the past, it becomes increasingly difficult to take his words at face value. To me, his call for a ceasefire seems less like a humanitarian gesture and more like a calculated political move designed to position himself as a global dealmaker once again, especially as he eyes a return to power. This isn't the first time Trump has used foreign policy as a stage for personal gain, and this current situation fits that pattern all too well. What makes me skeptical is how perfectly timed this so-called ceasefire initiative appears. The world is watching the Middle East with horror. The images coming out of Gaza are devastating. Civilians are dying. Infrastructure is in ruins. The humanitarian crisis is spiraling out of control. Amid this chaos, Trump inserts himself back into the spotlight, presenting himself as the one man capable of restoring peace. On the surface, it sounds noble, but when I dig deeper, I realize it's all very familiar. It's classic Trump, turning a tragedy into a moment for self-promotion. He knows that the global attention on this issue gives him a platform to project power, relevance, and influence. It's not about the lives being lost, it's about the optics. Trump has always been obsessed with legacy. His administration's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital was framed as a bold historical move, but it also stoked tensions that continue to this day. He touted it as a victory for diplomacy, yet it complicated peace efforts and further alienated Palestinians. That's what I see again with this ceasefire talk. It's not a sincere attempt to end suffering. It's a strategic effort to rewrite his own narrative and paint himself as a peacemaker ahead of another presidential run. And honestly, it's hard to watch because the lives of real people, families, children, entire communities, are being reduced to props in a political performance. I'm not suggesting that Trump is the only politician who uses international crisis to their advantage. That's a problem across the board. But what makes Trump's moves so striking is how shamelessly transactional they are. Everything is a deal, everything is leverage, everything is about winning. So when he proposes a ceasefire, I immediately ask myself, what does he stand to gain? And the answer is pretty clear. He wants to reclaim his image as a tough but effective leader. He wants to appeal to evangelicals who are fiercely pro-Israel. He wants to grab headlines, dominate the news cycle, and present himself as the only person who can handle complex global issues. And sadly, a large part of the media lets him do it, either by amplifying his message or failing to challenge it with the scrutiny it deserves. Another thing that bothers me is how his ceasefire proposal doesn't actually address the core issues of the conflict. It's more of a surface level fix, something that can be announced with fanfare and quickly spun as a success. But without justice, without accountability, without addressing the siege conditions in Gaza or the continuing expansion of Israeli settlements, there can be no meaningful peace. Trump isn't proposing solutions. He's proposing a temporary pause, likely one that benefits Israel politically and strengthens his own image at home. That's not diplomacy, that's damage control dressed up as leadership. I also can't ignore how Trump tends to reduce complex moral issues into black and white narratives. He has no patience for nuance. Hamas is evil, Israel is righteous, and anyone who questions that framing is immediately labeled anti-American or anti-Israel. But the truth is far more complicated. Yes, Hamas has committed horrific acts, but so has the Israeli military, and failing to acknowledge that only deepens the injustice. A real leader would speak with compassion for all innocent victims, regardless of what side they fall on. A real leader would seek lasting solutions, not short-term headlines. What's most insulting is how people are expected to cheer for this ceasefire proposal as if it's some grand gesture. In reality, it's political theater. It's Trump stepping onto a world stage not to help but to reclaim relevance. And that's what makes this so tragic. People are dying. Children are being pulled from rubble. Entire neighborhoods are being flattened. And here comes a former president eager to turn the chaos into a campaign slogan. To me, the danger in all of this isn't just Trump himself. It's what he represents, the normalization of using foreign suffering for political capital. It's the idea that leadership is about optics rather than outcomes. It's the way truth gets buried under self-congratulation and spin. And it's the silence from those who should be speaking up, those who know better, but remain quiet because calling out this hypocrisy doesn't serve their interests. I don't doubt that peace is possible. But peace will never come from political games. It will never come from leaders who see war zones as backdrops for personal ambition. It will come from honesty, humility, and a genuine commitment to human dignity, qualities we desperately need, but seldom find in the speeches of men like Donald Trump. When I watch the news these days, especially coverage of the Israel-Hamas conflict, I'm struck by how carefully emotion is manufactured and how selectively truth is presented. It's hard not to notice the patterns: who gets humanized, whose pain is prioritized, and which side of the story gets the spotlight. I've come to understand that media bias isn't always about outright lies. Sometimes it's about silence, omission, framing, and the clever use of emotion to control the narrative. And once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. The way the media manipulates public perception, especially in times of war, is both deeply effective and profoundly dangerous. One of the first things I noticed was how differently the media reports on Israeli and Palestinian casualties. When Israeli civilians are killed, headlines scream their names, their stories are told, their pictures shown, and their families interviewed. You feel their loss, you see the pain. It's real, and it's rightly acknowledged. But when Palestinians die, often in far greater numbers, the coverage changes. The victims become number statistics or vague references. Their names aren't mentioned. Their stories are rarely told. They are rendered faceless, nameless, disposable. That discrepancy isn't accidental. It's a choice. It's emotional manipulation at its core. This isn't just about what's reported, it's about how it's reported. Language matters. For example, when a Palestinian rocket hits Israel, it's described as a terror attack. But when Israeli bombs flatten a residential building in Gaza, it's called a military response or collateral damage. One act is framed as terrorism, the other as defense. Even when the victims are civilians on both sides, the framing suggests one group's pain is legitimate while the other's is unfortunate, but somehow expected. That subtle manipulation shapes public opinion more than most people realize. What makes this so insidious is how it seeps into our subconscious. We absorb these narratives without questioning them because they're repeated constantly. News anchors, headlines, talk shows, and social media all reinforce the same emotional framing. It's like a loop. Eventually, people start to believe it's the full truth, not just a curated version of it. And this emotional conditioning creates dangerous outcomes, justifying violence, enabling indifference, and silencing empathy. I've also seen how imagery is used to control perception. One photo of a crying Israeli mother can spark international outrage and political pressure. But images of dead Palestinian children or families sobbing over rubble are often avoided or sanitized. Sometimes they're even dismissed as propaganda. Why? Because those images make people uncomfortable. They challenge the dominant narrative, they humanize the other side, and for many media outlets, especially those in the West, that's inconvenient. So instead of showing the full reality, they show just enough to maintain their version of balance without upsetting their audience or advertisers. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but I do believe in agendas, and the media has one. Whether it's driven by political alliances, corporate interests, or fear of backlash, there is a clear reluctance to tell the whole story. There's a line they won't cross, and anyone who tries to go beyond it, be it a journalist, activist, or public figure, is often discredited, silenced, or labeled anti-Semitic or unpatriotic. That culture of fear and censorship is terrifying because it means truth becomes negotiable. And without truth, how can we ever hope to understand or resolve any of this? What frustrates me even more is how the media exploits our emotions. It doesn't just inform, it inflames. Headlines are designed to provoke outrage, fear, or tribal loyalty. Stories are edited to fit a narrative that divides rather than enlightens. And it works. People become emotionally invested in one side, often without understanding the full context. They defend what they've been shown, not realizing how much they haven't been shown. And in that emotionally charged environment, real dialogue becomes impossible. Nuance gets lost. Compassion gets replaced with loyalty, and the cycle of misinformation and hate continues. I think about the people who rely on mainstream media as their only source of information. They're being misled, not with outright lies, but with carefully filtered truths. They don't see the full human cost of this conflict, and that lack of visibility makes it easier to ignore or justify what's happening. And I don't blame them entirely. I blame the system that allows this manipulation to thrive, that rewards sensationalism over substance, and that punishes those who dare to question the dominant narrative. I'm not saying that every reporter is corrupt or every outlet is malicious. There are journalists doing brave, honest work, often at great personal risk. But their voices are too often drowned out by the louder, safer, more polished machinery of mainstream news. We need to start questioning what we're being shown and what we're not. We need to recognize when emotion is being used to steer us, to control us. Because until we do, we'll continue to be pawns in a media landscape that cares more about ratings and political alignment than truth or justice. In the end, I believe the media has a responsibility to inform, to challenge, to humanize. But right now, too many outlets are failing that responsibility. And as long as they continue to manipulate our emotions and twist the narrative, they're not just failing, they're complicit in prolonging the suffering of real people caught in a war most of us will only ever see through a screen. I often sit in disbelief, scrolling through images and news reports of children pulled from rubble, of families mourning their dead, of cities reduced to ashes, and yet the world carries on as if nothing is happening. What stuns me more than the violence itself is the silence that surrounds it. The global silence, the public complacency. It's not that people don't know, it's that too many choose not to care, or worse, pretend they don't see. That apathy has become one of the most powerful weapons in modern conflict. Not guns, not bombs, but indifference. There's something soul-crushing about watching tragedy unfold in real time and realizing how numb people have become. When I talk to friends or see people online, they often change the subject or scroll past footage of a war-torn Gaza or a bombed apartment complex in Tel Aviv as if it were just another piece of content in the endless stream of media. Some don't even flinch, others justify what they see with a quick comment about politics or religion. But what about the human beings beneath those justifications? What about the children, the grandparents, the teachers, the nurses? Somehow, we've reached a point where their suffering is acceptable, even invisible, if it doesn't fit into someone's preferred narrative. I think a lot about how we've normalized this indifference. Maybe it's the constant flow of news that overwhelms us. Maybe it's the distance. We feel safe behind our screens, thousands of miles away from the rubble and bloodshed. Or maybe it's just easier to look away than to confront the uncomfortable truth that our governments, our taxes, our silence, and sometimes our votes are part of the problem. It's easier to stay numb than to wrestle with guilt or complicity. And that's exactly how injustice survives. People will often say, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. But that excuse, repeated enough, turns into a wall of silence. It becomes a shield behind which entire populations disappear. What troubles me is how silence is no longer seen as a moral failure. It's become normalized. To stay neutral is seen as wise. To speak up is seen as extreme. But when innocent lives are being lost and you say nothing, you're not neutral, you're complicit. That silence sends a message. It tells the world that some lives are worth more than others. That some suffering deserves a response, while other suffering can be ignored. I've seen how easily people buy into the illusion that they are powerless. But that's not true. Voices matter. Public opinion matters. Social pressure matters. Protests, petitions, posts, conversations, they all matter. But they only matter if people are willing to step outside their comfort zones and confront the truth. Instead, too many people hide behind intellectual debates or political alignment. They talk about Hamas or Netanyahu as if that explains away the civilian death toll. They argue about who started what while children die with no understanding of politics or borders. The global community has shown time and again that when it wants to act, it can. Sanctions, resolutions, interventions, they're all possible when there's the will to act. But that will is shaped by public pressure. And when the public is quiet, leaders do nothing. That's why complacency is so dangerous. It doesn't just allow injustice to continue, it protects and enables it. The silence isn't passive. It actively fuels the violence. What makes this even more painful is the selective nature of the world's compassion. I've seen the same governments that rush to defend human rights in one part of the world turn a blind eye when it comes to the Middle East. I've seen massive global mobilization for causes that align with popular sentiment, while Gaza burns with barely a whisper from the same voices. That inconsistency doesn't go unnoticed. It sends a message that some people's lives matter more, that some victims are more deserving of justice than others. And then there's the fear. People are afraid to speak out because they don't want to be attacked, misunderstood, or labeled. They're afraid of being called anti-Semitic or unpatriotic. They fear losing friends, jobs, or followers. But fear is no excuse for silence when lives are at stake. Courage doesn't mean being fearless. It means speaking the truth despite the fear. If we all waited until it was safe to care, no change would ever happen. I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm just one person like everyone else. But I know that staying silent in the face of suffering is not an option. I know that looking away doesn't make the world a better place. It just makes it easier for injustice to thrive. I believe we all have a responsibility not to be experts, not to have perfect answers, but to care, to listen, to speak, to feel, and to act even in small ways. Because if we continue down this path of apathy, if we let silence become the default response to suffering, then we are surrendering not only our voice but our humanity. And that's a cost far greater than any war.